Development in the Madeleine McCann mystery. UK media are reporting that police have uncovered new evidence.
They're said to be looking at more than 20 plots of land in the easternmost part of Praia de Luz, near where the 3-year-old went missing all those years ago, but also close to the home of the main suspect, Christian Bruckner.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As a seasoned crime analyst and storyteller, I'm here to unravel the complex details of true crime cases and present them in a way that's both engaging and easy to understand. Today, we're diving deep into the latest developments in the Madeleine McCann case. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't a reporter. She wasn't even supposed to be working that night. But when the call came through, Silvia Batista, a senior staff member at the Ocean Club Resort, hurried to apartment 5A, unaware that what she was about to witness would haunt her for years. She was one of the very first people on the scene the night Madeleine McCann vanished, and while the world fixated on theories, suspects, and timelines, Silvia quietly held a different kind of truth. What she saw inside that apartment didn't match the story told to the world. The behavior, the atmosphere, even the smallest details, it all pointed to something else, something far more unsettling. Nearly 2 decades later, her account remains buried in shadow, but tonight we bring it into the light. The call came in just after 10:30 p.m. Something was wrong, very wrong. The police hadn't arrived yet. She was one of the first, and what she walked into wasn't chaos. It was confusion, controlled, rehearsed, and chilling in its stillness. In the middle of the room, Gerry McCann dropped to his knees in a posture so strange, so unnatural, it burned itself into Silvia's memory. His body was folded forward, his face pressed to the floor, hands clenched as if in a trance. He wasn't speaking. He was making guttural, unintelligible sounds, disconnected from everything around him. The moment was raw, but it wasn't grief that stood out. It was performance. What truly disturbed Silvia was not what people were doing, but what they weren't. No one was turning over furniture. No one was calling out Madeleine's name. No one was racing through corridors or checking other rooms. The tapas group instead were standing in clusters, on their phones, whispering, calling contacts, not the police, calling the press. Just outside that apartment, a child had vanished. And inside, those closest to her seemed more focused on messaging than searching. It was as if the idea of abduction had already taken root before anyone had even confirmed she was gone. The question that stayed with her wasn't who took Madeleine. It was why no one acted like she could still be found. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows bedtime stories or lullabies, but the kind that leaves a mark, the kind that feels wrong. When Silvia Batista stepped into the bedroom where Madeleine McCann had been sleeping, she wasn't prepared for what she would and wouldn't see. It was a space that should have screamed of urgency, of disorder, of a desperate search for a child. Instead, it was still, untouched, almost staged. The door was closed, the room was dark, save for a sliver of light leaking through slightly parted curtains. The shutters were down, the window sealed shut. The air inside felt preserved, quiet, not just in sound but in motion. 2 cots stood awkwardly in the center of the room, creating a physical barrier that made navigating the space difficult even in daylight. For Silvia, it was immediate. The layout didn't make sense. There was barely enough space for an adult to move freely, let alone for someone to lift a child, carry her silently, and slip out through a window without knocking something over. It was then that something deeper clicked into place. The story of an abductor slipping through the night, silently removing a sleeping child from her bed. It didn't match the room. The obstacles weren't subtle. They were obvious, tangible. The idea that someone could have climbed through that window, maneuvered around the cots, and carried Madeleine out without leaving behind a single trace. It wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. It was the story already spreading beyond those resort walls. Silvia didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the feeling stayed with her. This wasn't the scene of a break-in. It was the scene of a disappearance that left behind no struggle, no noise, no path of escape. The question wasn't just where Madeleine had gone. It was how the room looked like no one ever came for her at all. Gerry McCann stood in the apartment where his daughter had just vanished and told Silvia Batista something that didn't quite sit right. In the charged, disoriented moments following Madeleine's disappearance, he explained that he had personally closed the bedroom window, said it was to keep the twins from waking. A small detail, perhaps, but details matter, especially in a case like this. And for Silvia, that comment would later become the first thread in a web of contradictions that only grew darker with time, because not long after, Gerry's story shifted. Suddenly, the very same window he had closed was now open, shutters up, curtains disturbed. The explanation, an intruder. Someone had come in through the window, snatched Madeleine while the twins lay undisturbed, and disappeared into the night. It was a haunting image, and one that spread rapidly through headlines and press briefings. But inside that apartment, Silvia had seen the room herself. The layout, the obstacles, the air untouched by struggle or forced entry. Then came the forensics. The shutters, which Gerry claimed had been jimmied open, showed no signs of tampering, not a single scratch, no tool marks, no foreign prints. Investigators found that the only people who had likely touched that window were already inside the apartment. And that detail, scientific, undeniable, clashed violently with the narrative already set in motion. If the window wasn't opened by an outsider, who opened it? And why? Silvia didn't draw conclusions, but the inconsistencies unsettled her. She was there early, before the storm of media, before the legal teams, before the carefully managed statements. And what she heard from Gerry, in that fleeting, raw window of time, didn't match what would soon be repeated to the world. One story was told in the heat of the moment, the other after the consequences had come into focus. And in the middle of those two versions was a window, one that somehow stayed shut, stayed intact, and still became the centerpiece of an abduction story that never quite made sense. The word came fast, too fast. Before the police arrived, before the rooms were searched, before anyone had even checked the nearby stairwells, garages, or paths to the beach, abducted. That was the word, echoing through the halls of the Ocean Club that night. Not missing, not gone, not disappeared, just one term, repeated over and over again. Madeleine had been abducted. Silvia Batista was there in those early minutes. She watched as the McCanns and their friends clung tightly to a single version of events, as if the script had already been written. And what struck her most wasn't the panic. It was the precision. The way everyone from doctors to dining companions seemed to arrive at the same conclusion without question, without hesitation. There was no uncertainty, no room for other possibilities. And for Silvia, that certainty felt premature, almost rehearsed. While the natural instinct might have been to scatter, to call her name, to run through the resort with growing desperation, what she saw instead was coordination. Phone calls were made, not to local search teams or nearby security, but to media contacts, press figures, influential voices. Within minutes, reporters knew what had happened, and not just that a little girl had gone missing, but that she had been taken. And yet, no signs of a break-in, no forced entry, no eyewitness, no scream. Silvia couldn't say it aloud, not then, but the swiftness of it all unsettled her. It wasn't just the word abducted, it was how quickly it became the word, as if the group had instinctively agreed upon the narrative before the facts had even taken shape. She had seen real panic before, messy, chaotic, unfocused. But this was something else. It was grief wearing a uniform, fear speaking in unison. And as the night unfolded, that pattern never broke. In most cases, stories fall apart under pressure. People remember things differently. Emotions override logic. But this story, it stayed intact from the start. It was 3:00 a.m. when the request came. The resort was silent, blanketed in darkness as police officers moved quietly through the Ocean Club. Search efforts had slowed, hope was dimming, and yet there had still been no sign of a body, no confirmation of a tragedy. Madeleine McCann was missing, not found, not confirmed deceased, just gone. And that's when the McCanns asked for a priest. Silvia Batista had seen many things that night. Confusion, desperation, contradictions. But this was different. This was something she could never quite explain. In her years managing the resort, she'd never received a request like this under such circumstances. A priest is called when there's been a death, when the family needs spiritual comfort, closure, not when a child might still be hiding somewhere, frightened and waiting to be found. The police hadn't declared anything. No evidence of injury, no signs of a struggle. There was still time, still a chance. And yet, at 3 a.m, the parents were preparing for something final. For Silvia, the moment carried weight. It wasn't just strange. It was chilling, because embedded in that request was an implication no one dared to speak aloud. That hope was already gone, that the outcome was no longer in question. It raised unsettling possibilities. Did they know something others didn't? Had something been said or seen or felt enough to summon a priest in the middle of the night? Or had they simply given up, not after days, but hours? In most cases, parents resist that moment. They fight it, cling to every minute, every false alarm, every shred of optimism. But this wasn't that. This was surrender, quiet and ritualistic. Silvia didn't share her thoughts at the time, but the image stayed with her. A dark hallway, whispered conversations, and a priest summoned not for comfort, but as confirmation. No one had declared Madeleine deceased, but in that moment, it was as if someone already had. In the hours after Madeleine McCann vanished, time should have stood still. Every second, every heartbeat, should have been a frantic rush toward answers, toward her. But for Silvia Batista, what she saw in apartment 5A that night didn't match the chaos one might expect. In fact, it didn't resemble a search at all. Kate McCann sat on the bed, motionless, not sobbing, not shouting, just still. Gerry was with the police, offering information, recounting steps. The rest of the group drifting in and out of the apartment, whispering, making calls, faces lit not by panic, but by cell phone screens. Silvia watched it unfold in real time, and something gnawed at her. Where was the urgency? Where were the flashlights, the shouted names, the pounding footsteps down hallways and beaches and parking lots? The apartment should have been empty, abandoned in a desperate rush to find a missing child. But instead it remained strangely full of people, full of noise, full of contradictions. She had managed emergencies before, families separated, children lost briefly in the chaos of a resort. And every time it was the same: screaming parents, staff running, shoes forgotten, rules broken, voices hoarse from calling names into the dark. But here, on the night the world would later define as one of the most high-profile disappearances in modern history, no one was running, no one was searching. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A child was gone. Every passing minute mattered. And yet, to Silvia, The apartment didn't feel like the center of a crisis. It felt like the staging ground of a press event, one that had begun long before the first search had even started. She later gave her statement to police, recounting what she'd seen. It stood in sharp contrast to the televised interviews, the portraits of desperation, the crafted image of devastated parents. What she remembered was quiet, controlled, intentional. It was the sighting that shaped everything. A shadowy man crossing the street, a child in his arms, vanishing into the Portuguese night. That image, vague but powerful, became the cornerstone of the abduction theory. And it came from one woman, Jane Tanner. But what few people know is that Silvia Batista was there when Jane gave her statement. In fact, Silvia was the one who translated it. Jane described seeing a man carrying a small girl near apartment 5A, right around the time Madeleine vanished. The claim sent shockwaves through the investigation. It gave shape to the faceless villain, a narrative to feed the media frenzy. And that person was carrying a child. And you say a person, a male or a female? A male. A male. And just describe that individual to us. It's about probably 5'8" tall. He's taller than me, but not 6 foot. And so between those two. And he was wearing quite a lot of clothes. And that's one thing in hindsight, again, I think was quite odd, because tourists, when they're abroad, Brits abroad would always have cropped trousers or shorts or something, and he has sort of a big, heavy jacket and trousers on. But for Silvia, something didn't fit. Not the timeline, not the lighting, and most of all, not the angle. Jane had been on a narrow walkway near her apartment, a corner spot shielded by buildings, plantings, and architecture that made visibility limited at best, impossible at worst. From where Jane claimed to be standing, Silvia knew the layout well, and she couldn't understand how anyone, especially at night, could have seen what Jane said she saw. The street was tight, the view obstructed, the lighting dim, the margin for error enormous. Silvia didn't say Jane was lying, but she couldn't reconcile the physical space with the account being given. It gnawed at her, because this wasn't just any sighting. It was the sighting, the one that helped solidify the idea that Madeleine had been taken, that someone was out there, that this was a clean, targeted abduction. But what if the sighting wasn't real? What if it couldn't have happened the way it was described? The stakes were massive, because once a suspect narrative takes hold, it shapes the direction of everything: police focus, media perception, public empathy. And if that cornerstone moment, the very image the world clung to, was flawed, Silvia didn't have the power to rewrite reports or challenge official lines. But she carried the weight of what she knew: the layout, the shadows, the limits of human perception. When tragedy strikes in a place built for leisure, it's often the staff, the invisible hands behind the scenes, who remember the most. The ones who clean the rooms, check the bookings, walk the halls in silence. From the very beginning, the McCanns were never part of the Ocean Club's usual rhythm. Receptionist Rita Silva remembered clearly. They hadn't checked in through the resort's front desk. Their arrangements had been handled entirely through Mark Warner, the British holiday operator, managing certain properties within the resort. No forms, no standard registration, no presence in the system. To Ocean Club staff, the McCanns were technically invisible. It was a strange detail, one easily brushed aside until you consider what it meant. No central check-in, no local oversight, no record of where they were assigned or when. For investigators, that made timelines harder, confirmations trickier. A group this large, flying under the radar of resort procedure, created gaps in accountability, gaps in truth. It was the question at the heart of everything. Who was watching the children? From the beginning, the McCanns and their friends, the so-called Tapas 7, told police they were taking turns, rotating, checking on their sleeping kids every 15 minutes, while they dined just yards away from the apartments. It was a crucial part of their story, the assurance that although they weren't physically in the room, they were still being responsible, still vigilant, still good parents. But then came a quiet investigation from an unexpected angle. Joseph Mora, a private investigator from the United States working undercover for CBS, posed as just another tourist in Praia da Luz. No cameras, no press pass, no spotlight, just questions. And what he discovered shook the narrative's foundation. When he spoke to the waiters and bartenders who had worked the tapas restaurant that night, local staff with no agenda, no ties, he heard the same thing again and again. Nobody left the table. No rotating checks. No back and forth through the gate. No trail of concerned parents ducking out mid-dinner. Just a group of adults, eating, drinking, talking, never interrupted, never concerned, and certainly never leaving. If true, that changes everything. Because if no one left the table, then no one checked on the children. And if no one checked, then no one noticed when Madeleine went missing, which raises an even darker possibility, that the disappearance could have happened far earlier than they claimed, and gone unnoticed for far longer. And it's one of the most unsettling inconsistencies in the entire case, a moment where eyewitness memory and sworn testimony collide head-on, and in that collision lies the difference between neglect and cover-up. Joseph Mora didn't have badges or warrants, but what he did have was access. So they're going to have a difficult time in reference to coming up with additional resources, at least in Portugal, where law enforcement is going to look at this case seriously in any other direction. They're not going to follow the leads all over the world, as the McCanns have done with their own private investigator. He spoke with those who lived that night not through headlines, but through trays and tables, through tips and service. People who remember because they were there, not to investigate, but to work. If the parents were watching, then where were they when it mattered most? She was one of the first to arrive. One of the only people who walked through that apartment before the media circus, before the timelines hardened, before the world chose a side. Silvia Batista, operations manager at the Ocean Club, stood at the threshold of a mystery that would consume headlines for decades, and yet her voice was never the one amplified. Silvia didn't point fingers. She didn't give tearful interviews or dramatic press statements. What she offered was quieter, but far more unsettling. Observations, logistics, physical impossibilities, emotional incongruities, the things that didn't feel right. She noticed that the bedroom, supposedly the site of a frantic abduction, was dark and undisturbed, that cots were placed in the middle of the room, blocking the window through which an intruder allegedly escaped. She saw that no one in the group seemed to be searching, that phones buzzed faster than footsteps. And most disturbingly, she watched as every member of that tight-knit circle aligned around a single word, abducted, before the police had even begun their investigation. And yet her testimony never led the headlines. Her doubts weren't debated on panel shows or reenacted on TV specials. Instead, they were buried in official files, folded into witness statements, forgotten by the media machine. Why? Because Silvia didn't fit the narrative. She wasn't a grieving parent or a police officer. She wasn't a suspect or a savior. She was simply there, too close to the truth and too calm in how she delivered it. But when you step back, when you strip away the noise, the documentaries, the endless theories, you're left with something chilling. A woman who saw it all, who noticed the cracks before the world even realized there was a mask. And still, the world didn't listen. That silence says more than words ever could. In the end, it wasn't what was found. It was what was missing that told the story. No broken shutters. No signs of forced entry. Just a tangle of contradictions, rehearsed phrases, and a narrative that felt too polished, too soon. Silvia Batista didn't crack the case, but she shattered its illusion. Her quiet observations peeled back the curtain on a version of events that never quite added up. And as the world searched beaches, borders, and beyond, maybe the truth never moved at all. Maybe it remained behind, locked inside the stillness of apartment 5A, waiting to be seen. After hearing Silvia's account and the unsettling inconsistencies she observed, how does her perspective alter your view of the case? If you were tasked with decoding this case from the very beginning, how would you approach the information she provided, and what actions would you take based on her observations?